Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show.
You're listening to The Tom Daniel Show, and I'm your host, Tom Daniel. St. Patrick's Day. Well, it's almost here, which means that for a few days every year, America collectively puts on green clothing, drinks beverages that were never meant to be green, and announces, often very loudly, sometimes drunkenly, that we're all at least temporarily Irish. Well, that's fine. Every culture needs a calendar day, and every immigrant story deserves its rituals. But this episode isn't really about St. Patrick's Day. It's about how a people crossed an ocean, arrived in the American South, and didn't feel like strangers for very long. They didn't arrive with celebration or banners. They just settled in quietly. They recognized the landscape and they said, yeah, this'll do. And to understand that, we've got to begin with a sentence that makes everybody a little bit uncomfortable. St. Patrick was not Irish. St. Patrick was born in Roman Britain in the late 4th or early 5th century, which would be modern-day England or Wales. He was a Romanized Briton. He was raised in a Christian household, and he spoke Latin. He grew up inside the administrative world of the Roman Empire. Ireland at that time was not Roman. Rome conquered Britain, but it never conquered Ireland. No Roman cities, no provincial government, no imperial bureaucracy. Ireland existed completely outside the Roman Empire. Now, when the Western Roman Empire began collapsing in the 5th century during Patrick's lifetime, Roman provinces unraveled, roads decayed, cities shrank, and authority fractured. Ireland did not experience the Roman collapse because it had never been Roman in the first place. So when Patrick was kidnapped as a teenage boy by Irish raiders and taken to Ireland as a slave, he was crossing more than water. He was crossing into a non-Roman world, tribal, oral, clan-based, and independent of imperial structure. Now, he eventually escaped. He returned to Britain, and he entered the clergy. And then he made the decision that defined his life. He chose to go back to Ireland, not as a native reclaiming homeland, but as an outsider bringing something with him. He brought Christianity, literacy, Roman religious structure, connection to a transnational intellectual network. Patrick did not make Ireland Irish. Ireland already was what it was. What he did was introduce a new framework that reshaped it over centuries. Ireland did not become Roman. It became hybrid. And that hybrid, a blended indigenous structure plus imported literacy, would later position Ireland as a center of monastic scholarship at a time when parts of Europe were reorganizing after Rome's collapse. Now, Patrick wasn't a shield against the Dark Ages. He was just a turning point. He didn't look like a turning point at the time. But that's the thing about turning points. You usually don't recognize them until after everything is already changed. Now, that pattern, transmission across boundaries, transformation through contact, that's the real story of St. Patrick. And it foreshadows everything that happens later in the American South. So now, fast forward across several centuries. Now, when Americans say Irish, they often imagine a potato famine era Catholic immigrants arriving in Boston, Chicago, or New York. And yeah, though the Irish did settle there. Now, doesn't it seem like the Irish you find in Boston, Chicago, and New York are somehow different than the Irish all over the South? Well, yeah, that's because the Irish who settled in those northeastern cities are not the ones who settled the South in Appalachia. They're Irish, but they're different Irish. The people who shaped much of the upland South were what Americans would later call the Scots-Irish, a term created in America to describe Protestants from Ulster. Now, Scots-Irish does not mean Scottish people who liked Ireland a lot, and it doesn't mean Irish people with a Scottish accent. The Scots-Irish were largely lowland Scots Presbyterians who had been settled in Ulster up in Northern Ireland during the 1600s as part of English colonial policy. In other words, the English took them out of Scotland and stuck them in Northern Ireland. They didn't belong there. They also didn't belong to the English either. I mean, they lived kind of between identities. The English didn't really want them, and the Catholic Irish definitely didn't trust them. By the way, you know how the Irish flag has both green and orange? The green represents Catholic Ireland, and the orange represents Protestant Ireland. Just FYI. Now, by the early 1700s, economic pressure, religious discrimination, and political instability pushed many of the Scots-Irish to immigrate. They came to America, already accustomed to living on contested ground. And where they landed is crucial. They did not settle the coastal plantations of the South in large numbers. They didn't grow cotton. They didn't grow tobacco. They moved inland to the Shenandoah Valley, to eastern Tennessee, Kentucky. They moved to Appalachia. To them, the mountains were not an obstacle. That was home. Turning the Ulster Irish loose in the Appalachians was like tossing Brer Rabbit into the briar patch. They absolutely loved it. Ulster had trained them how to make do on tough land, hard farming, self-reliance. They were suspicious of outsiders and centralized authority. They favored local control. Reputation and honor were important to them, as was Scripture. Institutions were tolerated only cautiously. Now, this attitude wasn't invented in America. They brought it with them from Ulster. Over time, they stopped being immigrants. They became foundational to the upland South. They didn't build plantations. They built endurance. And they carried something else with them. Music. You're listening to The Tom Daniels Show, and we'll be right back.
What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show.
And welcome back to the Tom Daniels Show, and top of the morning to you, Mary Mac, for that stirring Irish version of our theme song. Mary Mac is the world's most perfect band. Have you ever noticed that when you think of Irish music in America, you don't think of Boston, New York, or Chicago. No, you think of hillbillies. When people hear Appalachian fiddle music, they often say, hey, that sounds Irish. And they're not wrong. But they're not exactly right either. What crossed the Atlantic from Ulster was not a playlist. It was a musical identity and a musical instinct. The Scots-Irish carried ballad traditions, long narrative songs about betrayal, exile, violence, and loss. And they were not pub anthems. They were memory devices, oral history set to melody. And once those instincts hit the South, transformation began immediately. The fiddle remained, but the tone shifted. Melodies stayed modal, but they got darker. And the rhythms loosened up a lot. The notes and the pitches bent. Precision gave way to emotion and feel. The Southern accent emerged as a musical instrument in and of itself. Irish pub music is communal, celebration music. But early Southern mountain music is survival music. It processes isolation, labor, danger, and mortality. It wanders. It ends unresolved. It leaves space hanging. And that's not an accident. That reflects their worldview. And then something even more important happened. Those Celtic-shaped instincts collided with African musical systems already present in the South. Rhythms, call-and-response structures, and tonal flexibility. What emerged was not Irish music. It was Southern music. It was cultural appropriation at its most magnificent. You can't pull the ingredients back apart. Celtic memory is there, but not as quotation, as shape. You hear it in pacing, in lament, in refusal to rush emotional resolution. That's why Southern music can feel ancient without really being all that old. It's honest about pain, and that honesty didn't originate in pubs and bars and saloons. It originated on front porches in the borderlands. Now, here's the final contrast. In Ireland, St. Patrick's Day was historically only a modest religious feast day. In America, though, it became a spectacle. Why? Because identity in America often has to be asserted publicly. 19th century Irish immigrants in cities were poor, stigmatized, and politically marginalized. Public celebrations became their way of saying, we are here, we belong, we survived. Parades signal presence. Green signals solidarity. Volume signals legitimacy. But the Scots-Irish who shaped much of the upland South didn't need to signal. They settled early. They moved inland. They integrated structurally. Their identity dissolved into the region instead of standing out against it. When identity is secure, then it can go quiet. When identity is contested, that's when it has to get loud. That's not judgment. That's just basic sociology. Now, St. Patrick himself was not Irish. He was a transmitter. The Scots-Irish were not simply Irish. They were already hybrid when they got here. Southern music is not Irish music. It's transformed memory. And St. Patrick's Day in America is louder than it ever was in Ireland because America required announcement. The South required absorption. Now, the American South did not invent Scots-Irish culture, and the Scots-Irish did not invent Southern culture. What happened instead was just recognition between the two. A people shaped by borderlands met a landscape that rewarded the same instincts. Over time, their rhythms, speech, suspicion of distant authority, religious intensity, storytelling habits, and musical instincts became part of the South's deep structure, not performed, but embedded. So when you hear a Southern fiddle line that sounds older than the country itself, you're hearing more than nostalgia. You're hearing transmission, and that story begins unexpectedly with a Roman Briton who crossed water, changed a culture, and proved that identity has never been as simple as bloodline. This has been the Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening. Keep learning.
Keep learning the Tom Daniel Show. Keep listening, keep learning the Tom Daniel Show. Take a break